Alina and people who have joined from Israel. I welcome you all for our webinar today. This monthly webinar is part of our centenary celebrations. Although we are living in unprecedented times, and because of COVID, because of the lockdowns, because of the war situations, some way or the other, we are all harassed by these situations. And because of these, probably each one of us is experiencing different levels of helplessness, anxieties, and fears. And that makes our today's topic quite relevant. Because in these times, we seek human closeness and relatedness, and we also dread it. We run away from it. Alina has joined us from Israel, although their country is going through a state of war, as you must be knowing, and so much of unrest. And this also triggers similar fears and anxieties, and at times numbs us and desensitize us. So, of course, she will take us into the journey of our primitive states. So let's begin without much ado. Today, our secretary from Mumbai chapter, Mickey Bhatia, will preside over the webinar. Mickey has been in this field of human rights and mental health for last 35 years. Currently, she is in private practice as a child and adult psychoanalyst for past 20 years. She's a member of PTRC, which is run by our Mumbai chapter, and actively engaged in the community with several NGOs and other organizations. She's a training analyst and teaches and supervises at all the courses that PTRC runs. I now pass on to Mickey. She would introduce Alina, and then we welcome Alina to start her presentation. Are you there? Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me?
But we can't see you. Is there a problem?
Why I can't see?
All right. If you can speak, we are okay.
So, good evening, everyone. Bhati, thank you for your introduction. Alina lives in Tel Aviv, and I was talking to her some days ago, and I must share this with all of you. She said, when we were talking about the paper and the presentation, that she might have to run off to the shelter in case there is an attack, but will return in 5 or so minutes. I have to confess that my heart sank when she said this, and hope did not happen. However, I read this morning that there's a fragile ceasefire announced. So now all my participants, Alina, I hope will not leave us. And for the duration of this meeting, there will be no void. And I hope lots of space for thinking. So please join me in welcoming Alina Schellekes to our fold. And I wish this could happen in person, but we all know the situation right now. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this paper as much as I did when I first heard it at the Tustin conference in Sydney, and look forward to a meaningful discussion. Our mental landscapes too are certainly affected by the corona situation, by the situation in Israel, and certainly all of us here have been affected in one way or the other. More about that later, I hope. Alina Schellekes is a senior clinical psychologist and a training and supervising analyst of the Israel Psychoanalytic Society. She teaches and supervises at the Israel Psychoanalytic Society, at the psychotherapy program, the Sackler Faculty of Medicine. Tel Avid University, where she's the head of the Primitive Mental States Advanced Track of Studies, which she founded in 2007. She was a senior clinical psychologist in the Adults Ambulatory Unit at Ramat Chen Mental Health Center, Tel Aviv, for more than 3 decades. In November 2018, she was appointed as chair of the Francis Tustin Memorial Trust. In 2006, she received the honorary mention of the Phyllis Meadow Award in New York, Excellence in Psychoanalytic Writing. In November 2008, she received in Los Angeles the 12th Francis Tustin International Prize for her paper, The Dread of Falling Absorbing, Further Thoughts. In case any of you have not read it, it is a must read. She's given lectures and clinical seminars in numerous places in Israel, as well as in Berlin, Boston, Mumbai, Los Angeles, Sydney, Warsaw, Basel, Madrid, and now very own Kolkata as part of the Centenary session. Her main topics of interest in her publications and in her teaching focus on the understanding of primitive mental states, voice states of psychosomatic states, daydream, the concept of double, therapeutic excess, and vitality. I do remember saying in one of her forewords that many people come to analysis appearing quite ordinary on the surface. However, once below that surface, we often come into contact with something quite unexpected. Extraordinary protections created to keep at bay any awareness of deeply traumatic happenings occurring at some point of life. I do believe that Alina successfully investigates the development and the function of these protections, allowing the reader to witness the evolution of the process of transformation, wherein defensiveness steadily mutates into communication. I welcome you, Alina, with that, and please take over.
So much, Mickey. It's, I think, quite moving to you and many of the Indian society whom I have already met and have long-standing relations with. And I think it's also a special occasion because both our countries have been going through very difficult times. We didn't know whether we will be able to have this webinar with the situation here, but fortunately enough, it seems that the Israeli government and Hamas heard about the webinar and they decided to have a ceasefire. So I hope everything goes okay. I would like, first of all, to thank Bharti for inviting me to this webinar as part of this special year in your society, and also for enabling a few colleagues from Israel to join this webinar. So we have quite a few present. Of course, the whole lecture will be in English. I will screen the lecture so you can follow the text. This might help. And then we'll see how we go. I will say every time what we are doing. So let me just share 1 second. Yeah, can you see? I suggest that you put it on a speaker view and drag the small windows of the Zoom to the left or of your screen so you can have the whole PowerPoint that I'm going to screen in front of you and see it in its entirety. So the name of my lecture is Arid Mental Landscapes and Avid Cravings for Human Contact, Beckettian and Analytic Narratives. And I will start with a short motto from Beckett, saying the work considered as pure creation, whose function stops with its genesis, is consecrated to the void. One second, I have to see how I do it here. Yes. Okay. The very function of writing can be a way of structuring and restructuring the chaos of experience, an ordering, reforming, relearning, and reloving of people as they are and as they might be. This is from Sylvia Plath's journal. Thus, the creative self transforms itself into the shape of the artistic creation, which absorbs, changes, and presents the self, living now in a different form in the artistic creation. A recurrent aspect that fascinates me in various artistic creations, and especially in Beckett's texts, is the discrepancy between the exact structural organization and verbal precision of the written text at one pole, and the quality of the emotional state portrayed in the text, either a chaotic or a void one, at the opposite pole. Many times, this discrepancy lies beneath the experience of the writer or that of the character portrayed in the text. In my view, such writings are fascinating as they succeed in expressing intense nuances of the human experience that are frequently unbearable, unformulated, and unspoken, such as a deep sense of futility, meaninglessness, formlessness, and emptiness. In such texts, one can trace the writer's ability to immerse themselves into and explore the deepest layers of the internal world, their own and that of others, and at the same time, the writer's striving and craving to express as piercingly as possible these layers of the mind. Thus, the final text in these writings, the end result of a very complex creative process, both gives voice to these deep emotional layers and simultaneously, by means of a very precise and geometrical use of verbal images and structures, may be said to create a protective shell that, at least momentarily, keeps the character portrayed in the text, or the writer maybe, protected from experiencing extreme fragmentation and loss of identity. These structures impart a sense of form, contour, and containment, which in extreme states may be lacking in one's experience. However, it is in no way my intention to suggest that such texts should be considered as a therapeutic means to deal with horrors of the void, but rather that they enable the reader to reflect on their power of verbally expressing very delicate levels of our humanity. As clinicians, we encounter void states of minds frequently, but most often they are not expressed directly by the patient, and many times we infer about their existence mainly through the defenses used against the unbearable impact of the empty existence. In my view, the richness of texts such as Beckett's enables us clinicians to find an additional vertex through which we can reflect on ours and our patients' unbearable and unrepresented states of mind. Though such readings cannot and should not serve as concrete therapeutic tools against the void, they do, in my understanding, enable us to contain and locate these unbearable void states in a space whose poetic beauty, humor, and sharpness of expression increase our ability to look steadily at such states, embrace and bear what is sometimes an unexperiencable psychic void. In this paper, I intend to focus on the experience of void, moving back and forth between the various survival strategies and protective shells employed in the attempt to avoid this experience. I will attempt to describe two distinct types of defense used against such arid mental states that are devoid of representation. On the one hand, I will focus on excitation envelopes, rebirth fantasies, and secondary symbiotic defenses of an adhesive quality. On the other hand, I will describe the repetitive, overly controlled use of rhythmic patterns of thinking, language, and movement, so as to develop an autistic-like protection against the sense of void and loneliness. In both cases, one can notice the oscillation between the defense employed and the still pulsating need and craving for live human contact, however scarce it may be. I will start with a short description of my encounter with David, whose numerous modes of escape from and survival against his internal void had no precise mathematical features, but were rather flooding his existence with extreme excitation-producing maneuvers, rebirth fantasies, and adhesive relations. David, a successful businessman in his 30s, came to analysis because he had long-standing extreme hypochondriac anxieties. Soon it became clear that his life was a never-ending attempt to overcome the nothingness of his existence, his inability to be alone, and a deep sense of lacking any form, direction, or meaning in his life. For all appearances, he lived a normal existence, succeeding in his business and married with children. However, in reality, he had no meaningful contact with his family members. He alternated between intoxicating himself with anesthetic pills and stimulating drugs, and accumulating vast amounts of medical information to enable him to create an illusion that he could control what was a formless existence, felt on the verge of physical and psychical collapse at any moment. As part of this attempt to regulate his body, he would undergo dozens of medical tests and subject himself to all sorts of dramatic experimental treatments in various medical centers in the world, each time organizing an extensive social entourage to accompany him. In addition, he adhered to whatever could give him an illusory sense of vitality. He had sex with dozens of women. He paid friends to accompany him all day in what seemed to him as live activities. He occupied himself with numerous seemingly exciting activities that could fill his time. And when none of these was available, he would feel lost, confused, and terribly anxious, as if he collapsed into a state of unbearable nothingness, not knowing what to do with himself and how to stay sane. Gradually, a very sharp and peculiar feeling started to become clear for me. In spite of his strongly felt presence and good intellectual abilities, his talking had the qualities of a logorrhea, a speeded and flooded talk with no traces of self-reflection and no ability to listen. I felt him as if he had no insight, no real contact with whatever inhabited his soul, reminding me of Meltzer's description of the autistic child who drew the two sides of a house on the same plane, as if the front and back of the house were one, with no sense of space or of three-dimensionality. David talked about various things that had happened to him between the sessions, with no real contact with me, giving me the feeling that each session was just a short stopover to be forgotten as soon as the session ended. Whatever he related was done in an extremely naive way, as if lacking any emotional meaning for him, beyond momentary sensual or narcissistic excitement. In addition, his narrative had a quality of dumping of facts, as if by so doing, no thinking process could take place, either in him or me. He would often describe how successful he was with women, how much his company was sought by many in his surroundings, even if he was simultaneously aware that all these contacts were actively maintained by him through financial incentives of various kinds. Though all these maneuvers had clear narcissistic and manic features, I came to regard them mainly as excitation and sensorial envelopes, which functioned as corks to stop up a deep emotional void, whose main feature was an ineffable and terrifying sense of emptiness and meaninglessness. Gradually, David started to portray a sense of chaos and futility in his life, though lacking any clear awareness of what he was describing, followed immediately by renewed attempts to create or adhere to an illusory, vitalizing object. Soon these attempts lost their soothing ability, and he became strongly suspicious towards most of his relations, declaring every other session his intention to make new and drastic decisions regarding his family, social and professional life. In one session, he declared that he stopped drinking and using drugs. In another, he declared that he would change everything in his life. He would leave his wife and children and start a new life. He would stop seeing any women. He would stop all his social relations and create new and better ones. He would go to another country and start everything from the beginning in a completely different way. Each session, he would describe how everything had already changed a long time ago, though barely a few days had passed, and it was as if all his sense of time was completely distorted. None of these dramatic changes really happened, but it became quite clear how much all these drastic plans of transmutation were imbued with fantasies of rebirth and renewal that gave him hope for a new life, devoid of the internal void in which he lived. Transferentially, he seemed slightly more relaxed and less suspicious in my presence. And for the first time, some months after the beginning of the analysis, I had the feeling that he had some contact with himself and that I could, for a few seconds, reach him. At that time, an unusual occurrence happened. He found an orphan kitten, a small cat, and became extremely moved by its fragility. He did almost nothing else but take care of it, as if a sort of blissful and never felt before fusion had taken place. He now seemed to be able to listen to me for a short time and was touched when I spoke of his softness towards the abandoned kitten, who needed so much of his care, a care he himself had so badly needed as a child. He became less embarrassed and less suspicious in exposing his vulnerable kitten self to me, while I was careful not to touch him emotionally more than he could bear at that moment. Pretty fast, the kitten grew big and less dependent, and soon enough, David felt deceived and lost interest in it. The vulnerable kitten David self that had just dared to express itself could not stand the flooding sense of meaninglessness and unbearable abandonment that was reactivated by the kitten's decreasing dependency on him and by losing the too shortly lived at-one-ment with it. In parallel, the fragile intimacy that had just started to evolve between the two of us was soon replaced by suspiciousness, and all his quasi-sexual, quasi-social secondary skin activities and omnipotent transmutation fantasies were back again. He looked puzzled and moved to see me trying to understand what went on in him, as if he had never previously experienced being present in someone else's thoughts. He even seemed to be curious to hear the way I interwove the kitten's growing and his own deep and old feelings of abandonment. However, these moments of emotional exposure and intimate contact between us might have flooded him or intensified the anxiety that the emerging feeling of togetherness might quickly vanish as soon as his kitten self developed in analysis. I soon received a message indicating that he would not come to our next session because he was on his way to the airport and planned to stay in another country for at least a month to check how things are there. He said he would contact me immediately after his return. Unfortunately, that was the last contact so far he had with me. He did not respond to any of my attempts to connect with him. And so, though apparently he left to stay in a different country to fulfill one of his rebirth fantasies, actually abandonment and premature separation occurred again, albeit with some role reversal, leaving me to experience much of what I believe had never been thought, understood, or represented in his psyche. Thus, I was left alone to experience the pain, helplessness, and emptiness one feels when sudden and incomprehensible loss occurs, experiences that I believe had been part and parcel of David's early life, when their occurrence had flooded him with unbearable anxiety. Paraphrasing Beckett's saying with which I began this article, the work considered as pure creation, whose function stops with its genesis, is consecrated to the void. I perceive that putting into words the experience with David has become the impetus for writing this paper and constitutes my way of bearing in mind and processing what could be experienced and digested by David. Moreover, it is also a limited attempt to consecrate this writing to the elucidation of the concept of mental void and of some defenses frequently used to alleviate it, while hoping that the function of this writing will not stop with its genesis. The concept of void, some theoretical considerations. The concept of mental void usually refers to a psychic empty area, lacking content, form, structure, meaning, and symbolic representations, all expressed through images such as abyss, chaos, black hole, emptiness, nothingness, stillness. The evocative power of these images reflects the very nature of the underlying unbearable anxieties, namely of falling forever, of dissolution into a formless state, of being emptied of one's own psychic existence and thinking abilities, of losing contact with self and other. In all these states, what is common is a mental lacuna devoid of representations, conflicts, and self-reflection ability. However, when taking a closer look at these states, some significant differences emerge that are relevant for the present discussion. So I will try to make some of these, to relate to some of these differences. Experiences of emptiness versus psychic void structures lacking representations. First, experiences of emptiness and boredom. That is when the person says, I feel boredom, I'm empty, and so on, and expresses this in a very clear way, are present in relatively well-organized personalities, including affective disorders and schizoid structures. In this case, one rather speaks of beyond's nothingness, a passive void, an empty mental space, albeit with a potential to be contemplated and filled with feelings and thoughts. We metaphorically speak here of the existence of an internal container, however empty it may be, which has a definite contour and ability to absorb experiences in a three-dimensional mental space. In contrast, in more regressed cases in the psychotic and autistic spectrum, in which no sense of container exists, one's experience can be of a tumultuous nothingness, written in one word, as you can see, subjectively felt not as a static emptiness or boredom, but as an implosive centripetal pull into the void. This is a state of having no floor, no boundaries, and thus no internalization of a mental space or container in which emotional experiences can be retained and processed. Devoid of reflective abilities and internal representations, such a state is typical of the black hole phenomenon, wherein the experience of chaos and meaninglessness is accompanied by the terror of being vacuumed into an abyss of non-existence. Following this differentiation, I will focus on these more regressive states that are filled with the acute terror of dissolution that mobilizes intensive defensive maneuvers. So let us focus on the origins of the lack of representations that is typical of this terrorizing state of psychic void. Tustin described the catastrophic anxieties that fill a child's psyche when he prematurely experiences a sense of separateness from the object, so that the self is torn apart from what was formerly experienced as part of the self. In primary states of undifferentiation, where self and object are symbolically equated, the absence of the object is felt as if part of the self has been amputated, thus being experienced as a black hole into which the psyche is in danger of being absorbed and annihilated. The autistic object, which so often functions as a palliative soother, becomes equated with a human object, and its potential disappearance creates the same terror as that of the human object. Thus, Tustin describes how sensorial maneuvers become a substitute for human contact, leaving one emptied of human representations. Grotstein took this view a significant step further, claiming that instinctual drives comprise semiotic signs that both herald the existence of an internal catastrophic state and attempt to regulate that state. Thus, sorry, something is covering my text, yes. Thus, intense sexual fantasies and behavior, as one can see in David's case, foretell the existence of the terror of falling apart, and at the same time, try to regulate this terror by creating a sensorial and narcissistic exciting envelope, whose aim is to blur the experience of nothingness and meaninglessness, which is felt insufferably unbearable when containing functions of thinking and emotional processing are lacking. From a different theoretical vertex, Winnicott viewed the lack of internal object representations that are typical of the psychic void as a result of traumatic experiences, such as too prolonged absences of the object at critical phases of development, or too strong inconsistencies in parents' behavior. These traumatic experiences bring about a decatexis of the object that finally results in a fading away of the object representation, a fading away, a slow fading away, making the negative the only reality. Following Winnicott's ideas, but with a different theoretical twist, Green connects between the traumatic aspects of the dead mother complex, the experience that mother is elsewhere, and the work of the negative, that is, the active involvement of the death drive. He assumes that the death drive is based on the assumption of a negative narcissism that aspires to extinction, and that is an expression of what he calls the disobjectalizing function, that is, destruction through disinvestment. The disinvestment can ultimately be directed not only towards objects and connections, but also towards the ego itself and all its previous accomplishments, so that the ego becomes impoverished, disintegrating to the point of losing its consistency, homogeneity, identity, and organization. To put it in different words, when the psyche is flooded with extreme unthinkable anxieties that are neither connected to nor contained by a represented object, then the disinvestment becomes the ultimate defense against unleashing of instinctual chaos. In such extreme cases, the psyche is actively emptied of its representations, so that the internal state becomes a barren and empty one, which not incidentally was called blank psychosis. In a similar way, Grotstein coined the term actual psychosis to designate a flooding state of anxiety resulting from the inability to experience nameless dread without ego disintegration. The actual psychosis, according to Grotstein, designates an extreme state of psychotic anxiety before the onset of blank psychosis, which in turn may be followed by a delusional paranoid restitution, functioning as the regulator and structuring factor in an otherwise terrifying void of meaninglessness. Thus, in a schematic way, we may envisage the following sequence. First, the actual psychosis, that is being flooded by unbearable excitation without any ability to process it. Then, the creation of blank psychosis, which is a sort of emptying oneself of fantasies and representations. And then the creation of paranoid ideation, which functions as a sort of delusional paranoid restitution, inserting some content that organizes one's emotional life through the delusion. In these extreme states, the loss of object representations becomes the basis for what Green called the negative hallucination, making one unable to perceive the object, even when it is present. Botella and Botella's conceptualization of the relation between perception and representation is highly relevant here. They describe how something can be perceived only if it is accompanied and reduplicated at a hallucinatory level. That is, only if the perceiver can find the object through his internal search after the lost and absent object. According to Botella and Botella, it is this hallucinatory sensory quality of the perceiver that makes the reality of what is perceived evident. Thus, to quote the Botellas, the perception of the world emerges out of the unpleasure related to absence, just as the representation of the real object emerges from the pain of its absence, end of quote. In this line of thinking, when psychic pain exceeds one's ability to understand and process, the psyche is flooded by an excess of excitation that fails to be represented. In this state, what becomes traumatic is neither the intensity of a perception or the content of a representation, nor the loss of the real object, but the psyche's loss of the ability to envisage, to hallucinate the object, ultimately losing its representation. When representation is lost, one is also lost in the realm of negative hallucination, unable to perceive and be in contact with the reality and qualities of the external object. I will go back to David. So after this theoretical intermezzo, I would like to say that what gradually became clear for me was that from a very early age, David's objects oscillated between a flooding, controlling, and intrusive presence at one pole and erratic absences at the other pole. His early life had no sense of coherence and continuity. He was moved from one location to another, many times in the absence of any significant other. Facing this tantalizing and chaotic discontinuity, David was left not only physically alone, but psychically in the realm of a black hole devoid of representations. He gave the impression, as I mentioned, of a person with no internal space, having neither any ability to comfort himself through a connection with internal representations, nor any ability to perceive objects, including myself, as having any real and meaningful presence. In addition, he had no abilities to reflect on his internal experiences, which would be a natural outcome of having developed an internal space for mental processing. Rather, he was flooded by unmentalized experiences, which continuously attacked him through hypochondriacal anxieties that became a signifier of an ever-threatening emotional and physical death. Thus, instead of internalizing a rhythm of safety, David lived in a rhythm of breakdown, recover, breakdown, where all the pseudo-medical interventions he submitted himself to fueled his rebirth fantasies of becoming a new person, physically and mentally cured and reborn. These recovery practices created repeated painful situations, as if enabling David to re-experience the initial traumas, albeit in a lesser form and under surveillance. The interventions did provide him with a sense of recovery and holding, but this sense rapidly faded away, as the care could not be profoundly perceived and inscripted in his psyche, since it met the negative hallucination. The lack of representation, either through a fading away or through an active disinvestment, ultimately left David again and again feeling practically alone and flooded with anxiety. I'll relate now to rebirth fantasies as a defense against mental void. In this context, it is interesting to note that the very notion of rebirth refers to a rhythm involving disruption and continuity, as is also described by Bion when he talks about cycles of being murdered, being all right, being murdered. For Bion, when coming alive is simultaneously associated with retraumatization, it is as if one is murdered every time one tries to come alive. As one comes alive, the object that murders life is intensely activated. As one puts oneself together, one also puts together the annihilating object. So it seems that I and the analytic encounter became both activators of rebirth fantasies and of the potential for retraumatization. The small kitten itself also carried the connotation of rebirth and aliveness, but soon became the murderer of that very fantasy. Moreover, it should be emphasized that David's rebirth fantasies portrayed a notion of birth with neither pregnancy nor labor. These fantasies expose time and again his lack of ability to bear the time and psychic work needed for growth and development. It seems that the time needed for such a mental process would have been unbearable for David, since such a time would have been perceived as a too threatening gap between the fantasy and its fulfillment. A gap which can be bearable as long as one has internalized enough good object representations to make one able to bear frustrations and survive the absence of the object. It seems that such a waiting would also have made David aware of his own lack, vulnerability, need, and dependency on human contact, which were grossly debased by David, who controlled his dependency needs by buying human services rather than letting himself experience spontaneous human contact. A few more thoughts about emotional versus structural mental void. The huge number of sexual relations and adhesive pseudo-object relations that David was involved in seemed to serve as survival defenses against his structural lack of representations. In this context, it is worth mentioning Lutenberg's differentiation between emotional mental void and structural mental void. The former relates to a feeling of inner hollowness or emptiness that is experienced emotionally and expressed as such, and is represented as an empty container waiting to be filled. I related to this earlier on. In contrast, the structural mental void, according to Lutenberg, refers to one split off portion of the mind, which has not undergone the structural evolution of the rest of the mind, and thus became a blank, empty space stripped of representations. This structural void is understood as a result of very intense traumatic circumstances that interrupt the normal symbiotic continuity between mother and baby. In such circumstances, a psychic abortion occurs, accompanied by terror, and a split in the ego is created, so that the evolution of this split-off part of the psyche is frozen. No psychic transformations occur within it, and the lacking object is substituted by pseudo-object relations rather than mourned and represented. This type of void is usually not expressed verbally, as is the case with emotional mental void, but is rather detected as lying under compensatory defenses employed against the nameless terror which accompanies the structural mental void. Most commonly, these compensatory defenses include symbiotic links which one adhesively maintains with persons, institutions, drugs, or sexual objects. Such symbiotic links function as partial compensatory containers for the terrorizing void, keeping the person together. Any break in these symbiotic adhesive links is not felt as a static emptiness, but rather floods one's psyche with unbearable terror, immediately enrolling again whatever defenses become available, such as neo-sexual practices, psychosis, autistic withdrawal. Coming back again to David, my understanding is that most of his emotional life was governed by these dynamics. He desperately tried to rescue himself from the terror of his void existence, sticking to whatever incessant superficial relations and excitations he could find, that temporarily calmed his thirst for contact, erecting rescue and recovery practices. And when none of these was efficient enough, he would simply collapse into a state of terrible terror and confusion. Now I will turn to autistic use of hyperbolically rhythmic movement as a defense against mental void. So I would now like to contrast David's varied defenses against the terror of dissolution into the nothingness of his emptying mind with a different type of defensive existence. I'm referring to the autistic use of rhythm as a main organizing and structuring defense. If we take the myth of Genesis as a metaphor for the state of the newborn infant, then the first lines of Genesis become especially relevant. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep waters. Thus, in the unintegrated state into which the infant is born, the infant will seize on anything that creates order and pattern, so that the formless state will not be experienced as a terrifying and chaotic infinite abyss, but can soon acquire some predictable structuring and soothing qualities. Developmentally, one's rhythm of safety includes oscillations between separateness and fusion, between tension and release, between binding and freeing, between stability and motility, between recurrence and change. These rhythmic oscillations, which enable separation and differentiation not to be experienced as existential threats, have a structure building function. Sorry. Even while in utero, the fetus experiences the rhythm of the mother's heartbeat and of her speech, alternations between engagement and rest, all creating first experiences of constancy and rhythmicity. The memory traces of these rhythms are absorbed in the nucleus of the prenatal psyche and constitute one of the first representations of the maternal object. After birth, too, sensations and experiences of rhythm continue to take root and expand, to now include the rhythms of breastfeeding, of stretching and relaxation, of breathing, of sleep and waking, of hunger and fullness, of presence and absence, of being with and away from the object. The rhythm of presence and absence thus becomes a structuring element and a prerequisite for internalization of reliable temporal shapes and of awareness of difference and separateness, which are prerequisites for any symbolic and representational activity. In various regressive states that are characterized by the structural void or by the black hole phenomenon described above, language and elaborate patterns, structures and rhythms, instead of being internalized as stable representations, are sometimes used hyperbolically as autistic shapes to ward off threatening nothingness. Thus, one can see that where under-structuralization of the ego core is predominant, an over-structuralization of its periphery develops, so that an outer rigid shell is formed against one's dread of dissolution. I have chosen to illustrate this state through some remarks related to Beckett's writings, especially to his short play Rockabye. In my view, a literary text often has the capacity to express and elucidate complex mental states, no less than a clinical presentation, and sometimes with a concentrated intensity, evocative power, and aesthetic purity. The rigid shell formation is particularly prominent in the linguistic and aesthetic ways through which Beckett portrays both the internal void and the human attempts to survive it, such as through the use of excessive rhythmicity and over-structuralization. For Beckett, whose long-standing ambivalence towards his mother tongue, and homeland was well known, writing became a place to live. Thus, the normal absence of the object, which in Tustin's, Winnicott's, Bion's, and Green's writing is a prerequisite for the development of thinking abilities, imagination, play, and vitality, is different from the devastating absence portrayed in Beckett's writings. Beckett uses images and linguistic and narrative structures, which are fractured and thus disrupt conventional expectations of coherence and narrative development. Simultaneously, all these images and structures are presented with a sharp sense of humor and irony and hard-forged poetic beauty, so that the texts both contain and locate the experience in a space or text where reader and audience can be in vivid and engaging, perhaps palatable contact with the experience envisaged. Beckett makes experiments with out-of-body voices, stripping place and body of any familiar coordinates, as his characters dream of other roads, other lands, other homes. There is rarely anyone at home, even if there is such a thing or place. He describes decrepitated bodies and minds enclosed in jars, dustbins, urns, thus using unsettling visual metaphors that stand for a deep sense of stasis, fragmentation, and immobility. The human landscape that Beckett creates is populated by creatures that have lost their memory, their ability to think, their time perception, and whose linking and relating abilities are drastically ruptured. Thus, the disinvestment function, working both intra and interpersonally, that Green has extensively described, is vividly expressed by Beckett's dulling of the self. And I quote, "What mattered to me in my dispeopled kingdom was supineness in the mind, the dulling of the self, and of that residue of execrable frippery known as the non-self and even the world for short," end of quote. In other words, many of Beckett's characters seem suffocated in a black hole type of existence, wherein no internal presences can soothe the dissolution anxiety. This internal dread leaves Beckett's characters oscillating between flooded existential states and emptied out blank existences. The former, similar to David's self-experience, can be met in his short monologue play, Not I, where a female, huge, red, made-up mouth screams an unstoppable stream of broken phrases that act as a mirror of a chaotic and fragmented self-experience. The latter, that is the emptied self, can be seen in Beckett's short play, Rockabye. The static and lifeless existence that is presented in Rockaby, as in most of his writings, seems to be alleviated by the use Beckett makes of structuring and hyperbolic rhythm-producing techniques. Beckett is a magician in his ability to sculpt the words he uses, the verbal rhythms he creates, the sounds he produces, and the precise syntactic structures he shapes, all put together in the effort to give controlled expression to the experience of the negative. I will screen now Rockaby short play and you to immerse in whatever experiences you will experience while watching this play, to immerse in both the ideational level and the sensual level, I would say. So let me just share a screen with the play. One second.
More, till in the end the day came, in the end came, close of a long day, when she said to herself, whom else, time she stopped, time she stopped, going to and fro, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for another like herself, another creature like herself, a little like, going to and fro, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for another, till in the end, close of a long day, to herself, whom else, time she stopped, time she stopped, going to and fro, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for another living soul, going to and fro, all eyes like herself, all sides, high and low, for another like herself, a little like, going to and fro, till in the end, close of a long day, to herself, whom else, time she stopped, going to and fro, time she stopped, time she stopped. More. So in the end, close of a long day, went back in the end went back in, saying to herself, whom else, time she stopped, time she stopped, going to and fro, time she went and sat at her window, quiet at her window, facing other windows. So in the end, close of a long day. In the end went and sat, went back in and sat at her window, let up the blind and sat, quiet at her window, only window, facing other windows, other only windows, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for another at her window. Another like herself, a little like another living soul, one other living soul at her window, gone in like herself, gone back in the end, close of a long day, saying to herself, whom else? Time she stopped. Time she stopped. Going to and fro. Time she went and sat at her window, quiet at her window, only window, facing other windows, other only windows, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for another like herself, a little like another living soul, one other living soul. More. Till in the end, the day came, in the end came, close of a long day, sitting at her window, quiet at her window, only window, facing other windows, other only windows, all blinds down, never one up, hers alone up, till the day came, in the end came, close of a long day, sitting at her window, quiet at her window, all eyes, all sides, high and low, for a blind up, one blind up, no more, never mind a face, behind the pane, famished eyes, like hers, to see, be seen, no, a blind up, like hers, a little like, one blind up, no more, another creature there, somewhere there, behind the pane, another living soul, one other living soul, till the day came, in the end came, close of a long day, when she said to herself, whom else? Time she stopped, time she stopped, sitting at her window, quiet at her window, only window, facing other windows, other only windows, all eyes, all sides, high and low, time she stopped, time she stopped. more. So in the end, close of a long day, went down. In the end, went down, down the steep stair, led down the blind and down, right down, into the old rocker, mother rocker, where mother rocked. All the years, all in black, best black, sat and rocked, rocked, till her end came. In the end came. Off her head, they said, gone off her head. But harmless, no harm in her. Dead one day, no, night. Dead one night, in the rocker, in her best black. Head fallen, and the rocker rocking, rocking away. So in the end, close of a long day, went down. In the end, went down, down the steep stair, led down the blind and down, right down, into the old rocker. Those arms at last, and rocked, with closed eyes, closing eyes, she so long all eyes, famished eyes, all sides, high and low, to and fro, at her window, to see, be seen, till in the end, close of a long day, to herself, whom else, time she stopped, let down the blind and stopped, time she went down, down the steep stair, time she went right down, was her own other living soul. So in the end, close of a long day, went down, let down the blind and down, right down, into the old rocker, and rocked, rocked, saying to herself, no, done with that. The rocker, those arms at last, saying to the rocker, rock her off, stop her eyes, fuck life, stop her eyes, rock her off, rock her off.
I assume you need time to digest this powerful play. We don't have that much time, so I will go on just to apologize for a few mistakes that I discovered in the subtitles that only today I somehow succeeded in putting on it. And there are a few spelling mistakes from the internet. One second. The name of the play reminds me of the lullaby in which a baby's cradle falls from a tree, thus bringing together in one song both the image of a seemingly nurturing and lullaby singing mother, that of a vulnerable dependent baby, suffering threatening loss and trauma, as hinted by the fall of the cradle, and that of aging, decline, and death in a rocking chair. The play is a disembodied monologue of a voice recorded on a tape, separated from the lonely woman, all dressed in black, who listens to the recorded rhythmic and repetitive tonality and cadence of the voice in the monologue, expressing her thoughts, while ritually being mechanically rocked back and forth, up and down. These were Beckett's instructions. The normative soothing effect of rocking that is frequent when infants rock themselves so as to achieve balance, as before being able to stand steadily or walk, or when they are rocked by parents as a comforting means, becomes a repetitive and stereotypical type of movement in rockabye. Lonely and deserted, the woman is left in her rocking chair, craving and hoping for human contact with one other, a little like herself. Though searching for another living soul, one can easily notice the blocked, terrified, and fixed, famished eyes that are unable to perceive any other human presence in spite of the craving for contact. Here we see again how the negative hallucination is of such intensity that perception becomes impossible, and the empty window panes become a reflection of the woman's pains and inability to make any contact, while the blinds of the windows become a mirror image of the emotional blindness and aridity of the rocking woman. The woman is dressed, so it seems, in what used to be her mother's black dress when mother rocked herself to madness and death. Thus, the images of mother and daughter are condensed and superimposed, annulling any possibility of escaping mother's fate and hinting at the same static and withdrawn existence. Moreover, the woman's rocking can be viewed as a primitive body imitation of the type Gadini spoke about, through which the woman, by imitating her mother's rhythm, performs a ritualistic autoplastic effort to re-establish contact with a moving and soothing mother. The only words the rocking woman expresses in a repetitive but precise rhythm are, at one pole, more and living soul, as if asking to continue the rocking ritual, the only movement that enables her to keep the illusion of living and the hope to find contact and be psychically reborn. And at the other pole, the words time she stopped and rock her off, that express the woman's resignation from her attempt to feel she has an eye, in its both senses, that can see and be seen. The failure to encounter and perceive another, and in Beckett's words, rock her off, stop her eyes, fuck life, stop her eyes, rock her off, ultimately brings the woman into a fatal psychic retreat, thus droning into the image of the very absent dead mother, who in the end came off her head, from whom she desperately tried to escape, and at last fading in her own deadening existence. I find this play fascinating, both in terms of the void existence it strives to capture, and in terms of the precise and exact structure of the play, whose rhythm of construction, of repetition, and no less of sarcastic irony is built with both intense emotion and mathematic precision. As I mentioned earlier, the exactitude of this structure in Rockabye, as in many of Beckett's plays, does not reflect, in my view, the balanced interplay between absence and presence, or the reciprocal and rhythmical activity between mother and infant, which is necessary to transform bodily sensations into psychological experience. Rather, it portrays mechanical and stereotypical features that function as an outer protective shell, which creates an ordering pattern in an otherwise formless, disintegrating, and alienated existence, lacking any internally holding structures. In retrospect, it has become clear to me that the process of writing this paper was catalyzed by my experience with David and by my, and maybe his, need to keep him in my mind in his absence through writing, and thus reliving, rethinking, and reshaping our experience. In a similar way, it is my view that Beckett's deep personal experiences of primary object, absence, function as intense catalysts for his rich body of writing, while his apparently uniform and static texts become powerful emotional carriers and active containers, not only for the extreme loneliness and disintegration of his characters, but also for the anxieties that Beckett himself seems to have struggled with, and for expressing so powerfully and creatively the unthinkable and unnameable that each of us experiences. One can think of Beckett's writing and rewriting on certain themes not only as a repetitive act, but as a derivative of a rebirth fantasy. Each new text, though sometimes thematically similar, creating a new and rich self and affective experience. Moreover, it is worth remembering that Beckett's self-imposed exile from his homeland to France and from his mother tongue was followed much later in his life by his coming home, by translating nearly all of his writings himself back into his mother tongue, into English, thus renaming, reshaping, and recreating his texts and himself. Personally, I feel a great emotional debt to a man who enabled me not only to name much of what at times feels unspeakable and unbearable, but also to do it from a bearable aesthetic distance and with a smile. Thank you very much. I will stop the share so we can see one another.
Well, thank you so much, Alina. It was so powerfully creeping. The play and the kind of rhythm that was, it was not soothing at all, it was scary. And the more, like when you said immerse in that, if you really immerse, you want to run away from it. You don't want to immerse in that. That's truly, powerfully, very scary. And like you said, it truly captures the unnameable and unbearable emotions. So
Maybe
yeah.
some of you can read some of the chats. I couldn't during the lecture, so if there is anything that you think can add to the discussion.
Let's hear from the audience. So let's hear from them. If anybody wants to have any comment, let's hear from Mickey first, and then let's open it to everyone else. Mickey, you are muted. No, we can't hear you. You're still muted. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Where's Alina? There. So Alina, your experience, the experience you've just given us
is beyond words. Your experience of David is poignant, and I understand that the impetus of writing this paper came from your experience of him and became a way for you to hear him and bear him in your mind. Quoting Beckett seems to be so apt, and I would love for you to give us a little insight on why Beckett, how did you find this particular play? Um, the marriage just seems so perfect between Beckett and what you were trying to say. I must thank you for introducing me to some of his works, and I've been doing nothing but poring over them. It transpires, just to let the audience know, and I'm sure most of you know, that he was actually in analysis with Wilfred Bion. The ascertainable facts of Beckett's period of analysis with Wilfred Bion are like the prayers of a lukewarm soul, faint and few. It is indeed striking that he was a young man of 27 years, taking the first steps in his literary career. Shortly after beginning analysis, he wrote, "More pricks than kicks." Bion was a trainee therapist at the time himself, undergoing therapy with J.A. Hadfield. This was around 1934, and by all accounts, the analysis was difficult, but sustained for nearly 2 years and seems to have had some benefits. Beckett and Bion were both intractable characters who encountered and provoked considerable resistance in each other. Though Beckett remained doubtful about and hostile towards psychoanalytic theory and procedure, Bion seems to have had the intelligence and breadth of cultural knowledge to gain Beckett's respect. One cannot help but feel that something more momentous should surely have ensued from this meeting at a formative time for both of them, of a man who was to become perhaps the most important European writer of the 50s and 60s, and a psychoanalyst who was to become one of the most famous and distinctive English psychoanalysts of his generation. Although Bion undoubtedly remembered his analysis of Beckett, he never referred to it directly in his psychoanalytic, creative, or autobiographical writing. And Beckett seems rarely to have spoken again of what he may have come to regard as an unproductive and even misguided episode in his life. He had begun Murphy, his first masterpiece, and during analysis, breaking off from analysis seems to have enabled him to complete the novel in the following year. As some have suggested, there is a pattern which is repeated later and in different ways. The breaking off from analysis produces a complex, non-analytic, but nevertheless a reparative response in Beckett's own writing. This, of course, brings me to the question of our own mental landscape as clinicians, as some of us are, and what it does to us every time we encounter these voids from a patient. We would really need to rely on our own good enough object relations and representations to make one able to bear frustrations and survive our patients leaving, like David did, in whatever way possible. Alina, I would love to hear more of your thoughts about what happened in your mind after David left, your fantasies of what became of him. I wish we had more time to share experiences of what happens with patients that we've had who've left, who've never come back, some who've stayed because we found a language to talk to them. But more of that later. Throughout our clinical training, we've also heard and been told that patients who do not have a good enough internal representation can prematurely leave their analysis. Should they have taken analysis in the first place? Alina would love you to throw some light on that as well. As head of the Primitive Mental States Unit, can you talk to us a little bit about assessing patients? These rhythm or the rhythm of the rebirth fantasies that you speak of are so beautifully illustrated by Rockaby, pronounced Rockabye, and the lullaby Rockabye Baby. In the nursery rhyme, the melodic nature of the song can put a baby to sleep, yet the words also give the parent permission to sometimes harbor some thoughts that are not necessarily very endearing. So as it goes, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. Amusingly, I chanced upon the fact that this has been altered somewhere to say, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. Daddy will catch baby, cradle and all. Again, for those, well, now you've seen Rockaby. The meeting and parting of the analytic structure with David worked well till the vulnerable kitten David self had just dared to express himself, but then could not stand the nameless dread that came in with the end of one session and the beginning of the next. Alina, in conclusion, I would like to read this paper over and over again as we live through this pandemic and try to make sense of our own mental landscape. Unfortunately, today I have to share you with all those others listening. So let's bring forth the questions. Please, if you could raise your hand, and then Bharti or myself will get to you in due course. I just want to quote what Alina said to me in an email way back in 2012 after our trip to Sydney. She said to me, you know, writing is a developing process, by which I mean that it both develops in time and it develops the writer. So if you feel the urge to write, don't wait till it's the right moment, as I think such a moment is hard to define and it becomes a frightening, elusive, godlike sort of thing. I'm truly inspired, Alina. You've given us much to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you so much. How much time do we have? So, because I think
We still have half an hour to go into, and we can just spill over for 5-10 minutes more if we are stuck into something.
so would you like first the audience to express some thoughts and questions? Would you like me to relate to some of Mickey's questions? How would you like it?
You may start, Alina, first, because you know these questions are fresh, and then let people come up, and then we will take it 1-2 questions at a time.
First, really thank you, Mickey, for so much thought that you put into your words. And you ask a few things, and I think that the answer to these questions would take quite a long time. But I will try to say just a few words. You asked how I came to find Rockaby. I have no idea. I have no idea in the sense that Beckett has been for years one of the writers that I find amazing in his ability to express human suffering in such an exact and precise and even humorous way. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He had a very difficult childhood and life, and it took many years until he was recognized as a very interesting and amazing writer, and culminating eventually in receiving the Nobel Prize. But for many years, he was not published, and many people didn't find anything in his writing. So anyway, I don't know when I started reading Beckett, but it's been for many years. So as part of this reading, I came upon Rockaby and saw many of his plays done by the Irish Broadcast, I don't know, corporation or something, which are quite amazing. Many of his plays, I must say, if any one of you has interest in reading, have very exact instructions by Beckett, giving detailed explanation of how he wants the play to be done, including this rocking chair that has a motor. So a motor actually activates this rocking chair. It is not the woman, it is a motor that activates it. This is what I can say about how I use Beckett. And I used him a few times, I think 3 times, with another play and a short story in different papers that I wrote, from the same reasons, that I think he he can express sometimes more exactly than any patient can do it verbally. So that through reading him, I think we get a very sharp view into unbearable states of mind. That's what I would say, as I said. Since you touched upon the motivation for writing, I think for me writing, when I feel that the writing really is meaningful and expresses myself, is when I am bothered. When I deal with something that preoccupies me, either theoretically or clinically or personally, I don't know, or all of them together. So it keeps going on in my mind, and that's the catalyst for my writing. I sometimes I have to write something because I am asked to, but that's a different thing, I like that less because then it is order from the outside and not necessarily a result of a sometimes quite tormenting process. So when you listen to a lecture or you read a paper, which is written in a reasonably organized way, I think the reader or the listener is not aware of all the ups and downs that a writer goes through until he succeeds in really putting into words what is sometimes so difficult. So I find that many times my drive for writing has been from therapies or analyses that are not so aesthetically finished or terminated. And I think each of us has many more of these than the so-called good terminations. But anyway, I saw that in at least a few of my papers, actually, there are cases through which the writing became a sort of digesting process for various complex issues in the therapy that created situations which were beyond the patient's, sometimes the therapist's, ability to bear. And I think for David, this intimacy that started to be created and intimacy in which I succeeded eventually, took quite a long time, in which I eventually succeeded in touching him, was in a way too much for him to bear. And he couldn't stand at that stage of development of his mind. He couldn't, in my understanding, stand this intimacy. In another paper that I once actually gave in Mumbai, like some 6 years ago, I coined the term toxemia of therapy. Yes, to exactly relate to such cases in which a therapy or an analysis can get to a too highly saturated situation, not because we do too much, but by our very presence or emotionality or aliveness or human contact that sometimes is unbearable because of all sorts of reasons that we don't have time to get into, that the patient feels and cannot digest. So I think that was the motor of my writing about David, and then it developed into what I developed, yes, but I was left in a very, how would I say, in a very puzzling and I don't find the word in English, but let's put it suffering state, having such a termination when a patient completely disappears with no sign of life. I think I can stop now so we can have time for...
I also noticed that he wrote to you when he was on the way to the airport. No gap.
Yes, no gap, right. I assume he came back. I assume he didn't stay in another country, but all these are fantasies are not so much relevant to what we are discussing. I think he actually created or recreated another situation of abandonment, loneliness, lack of understanding that actually I felt through my own experience, and that he probably had felt so many times in his life. So I'm keeping talking about a person who is actually absent in my life or experience, and I keep him in my mind as a sort of making him present in a place where he could not continue being present.
Alina, just another question which might bear relevance to what you're saying is that I'm sure when we all lose patience, we wonder, could somebody else have been able to hold him? What did I do wrong? Or where did I go wrong? I just wanted to ask you, and this is actually regarding a patient of mine that you supervised at the clinical session way back in Sydney, yeah, who's still with me. And actually, I mean, sometimes I don't know where I am with her, but I just have to share that sometimes even small sentences, when you find that kitten self, like, I'll be back, when you're talking about a break, or take off your socks, you know, has so much meaning rather than holding on to the structure. I just wanted to say that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you understand the power that these small sentences have on your patient? What do you think they do for her that they are so?
I think I'm just holding her at that moment, and there's no one else that exists in the world except her at that given moment. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe fulfills her fantasy for a few seconds, for a few minutes. It's like all the anger dissipates. It's like from being terrorized, from being shouted at, it's like, felt like a deflated balloon. It's like just, you know, you just feel that one could talk to her again, like talking was possible. The anger will return, and it does, but there are a few windows where talking is possible.
Mm-hmm.
We have lots of people who are attending. Would anybody like to ask Alina some questions?
Yeah, there are people. So there is Manju and there is Dr. Mehta. So, well, Manju, you can go first, and then probably Julie, you can come up. Yeah,
So,
Manju.
Alina, thank you for a beautiful paper. And I was thinking about what you'd written, that his parents couldn't keep him in mind. But there is a you who has kept him in mind and written a paper. So what impact do you think this could have on him, even though he doesn't know about it? If any?
I think it depends on the degree of optimism or pessimism that I decide to use. I can say maybe in a burst of optimism that by keeping thinking about him and writing about him or talking about him, the situation of containing him in my mind and processing him is a very important occurrence, yes, and I do believe that. However, I think that his inability, at least at that moment, to keep going in his analysis makes this keeping in mind of mine a very, in the end of the day, a very lonely process that he doesn't share. I mean, a few years have passed since then, a few good years, and I don't know what happens with him. He might have gone to another therapist, and that would be a great thing. I mean, if the experience of being held in one's mind has become something important for him, meaningful for him, even if he doesn't know to define that as such, and he did go to someone else, that's good enough. But I don't know if that happened. I don't know. He might have continued with his adhesive practices and taking a lot of drugs, psychiatric ones and other drugs and all his practices, and maybe he's living the same life. I have no idea. I do think that by trying to process these things, it is an important process that we as therapists can go through, even if the specific patient that triggered them is not present. I think that I learned a lot, not in an easy way, through this patient and through the writing about him, that is very meaningful for me, not only for him, but for coming in contact with other patients who resonate something of David's existence. And I do have quite a lot, very, very heavy patients that are not identical, but have many similarities. So this processing that we do has its own value. I'm not sure to what extent is of any value for David, but that's what I can say.
Thank you.
Yeah, Julie, you can go ahead.
You're on mute,
You're
Julie.
mute.
First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to my old dear friend, Mickey Bhatia, who I had the privilege of going to school with. And then I've seen her blossom into this amazing, amazing therapist. So Alina, what can I say to you? In a very colloquial term, I've been gobsmacked because I teach English literature in both University of Toronto and now in India, where I'm stuck with the pandemic. And I think what came to mind when you began your talk was with Sylvia Plath's quotation about the very function of writing is an ordering and restructuring of chaos. And this has sort of punctuated all the work that I'm interested in. So if you're talking about Virginia Woolf, married to such an illustrious writer, or if you're talking about Sylvia Plath, these are women who are extraordinary women, but they were driven to such depths of depression that they both committed suicide. And they were contemporaries of Beckett, of James Joyce. They were all modernists. I'm talking of someone like T.S. Eliot as well, who went through severe bouts of clinical depression. And what I find fascinating is the way you've connected the dots for us. And the modernist period was 100 years ago. The Second World War, the First World War, the Spanish flu, which took away 50 million lives. And there was a total upheaval and dysfunctionality, dystopia. But it's the same thing that we are sort of living through now. So what I think has been very meaningful for all of us here who come from different functions in society and from different cultures is that you do give us a ray of hope in the way that you bring the idea of the empowerment that comes from writing. And all great writing comes from a place of great sorrow, they say. So would you say in some ways that maybe now when you look back, Beckett appealed to you because of this, the bit about his life where for years he was in such severe depression that he was in bed, couldn't get out of it. Would you say that it's this aspect of that ray of hope as a clinical therapist that you bring to today's talk, Alina?
Obviously, I found very deep connections with Beckett's state of mind without having been clinically depressed and without going into maybe irrelevant disclosing at this moment. But of course, there are echoes in my own mind that some time ago, a friend of mine who is now 85 asked me, and she put it this way: how can you read such heavy writings? Why are you attracted by it? And I was somehow quite astonished by the question. I was wordless. I didn't know how to respond to that. But it was clear that I have an affinity that some other people would not. And I did read biographies of Beckett, and I am aware of how his life has been difficult. By the way, relating to what you brought, Mickey, about his analysis with Bion, that was 2 years long, and quite a lot has been written about that. It seems that we therapists and analysts have done a lot about that therapy. Beckett had a different view. I mean, I think it is also part of our idealization of Bion, and I think it has a magical effect upon us to imagine such a couple, Beckett and Bion, yes, two major figures of European culture. But it seems that Beckett denies or negates the effect of that analysis. Does it mean that it didn't help him? Not necessarily. But that was his conscious, more or less, expression. I think that that by using what seemingly seems very desperate, he has a very desperate writing. But when you become acquainted with his writings, I think one can find so much humor, so much processing of the desperate elements. And that's why I said in the end, my last words of the lecture were, "and with a smile." Yes, and you can say, what sort of smile? Rockabye is a terrible play, but when you see it time and again, you can see very, very, very sophisticated humor in anything that he writes. Yes, and I think it is part of his ability to stay alive in these desperate states, so as to process whatever he felt into language in such a way that the desperate part became a communicable statement, and a very sophisticated one, a very philosophical one, and a multi-layered message, I would say. So that's what I find fascinating in him. And I think we need sometimes, in addition to supervisors or whatever helps us or theory, we need some props or other means of help. And for me, going away from therapy to all sorts of places and coming back is such a help. Yes.
Thank you very much. That really sheds a lot of light. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish more people would write about failed therapies, but that doesn't happen so much. I think we would gain very much if we were able to write more about that.
The ones that succeed or the ones that don't succeed, Alina?
The ones that don't succeed, failed therapies.
Yeah. I guess it's so painful.
Well, I agree with you, Alina, because it's only the frustration and the failure that teaches you something. Success, yes, it gives you a lot of confidence, not much learning. That mostly comes from frustrations and failures.
But you know what, Bharti? I was been listening to Alina carefully, and I was also thinking that a patient leaving is not necessarily a failure, right? I mean, he's must have taken something with him. I mean, Beckett must have, even though he didn't acknowledge it, he must have taken something with him. I believe he wrote Rockaby when he was 75 years old, Alina, if I'm correct. It was one of his last
Late
works.
writing.
It was in the 80s. I don't remember exactly his birth date. Maybe you know, Julie.
It was 1981, I think. I must share something. I cannot keep this back. But my parents were, they were avid theatre goers. So once a year, the only valuable gift they gave us was they took us to England, and London was museums, was whatever. The first and the only time that I saw a Beckett play was thanks to my mother dragging us to the Cottelsloe Theatre in I think it was 1982. And I was, I was so confused. I don't think, till much later when I formally understood after studying T.S. Eliot and the doppelganger effect of self and trying to see the self as the other, and then without dropping too many theorist names, I think all of you in clinical in the area of therapy would understand Julia Kristeva's ideas of powers of horror. And when you talked about David, Alina, I thought about my student in University of Toronto. He was Sri Lankan, so there was a race issue. He was gay, so that was another point where his family pretty much abandoned him. Brilliant student, came through a scholarship, but he had the most amazing pets, which othered him even more at home, which were snakes. And when I got to know him, it just blurted out. He just blurted out that those are the creatures which other people hate, like people hate me. So I find, an affinity with snakes. So, all that you talked about today punctuated a lot of things from my past. So I thank you for that. Thank you.
We have a few more moments to go.
Christopher.
Yeah.
Sarosh, you have to
Sarosh, yeah.
unmute yourself.
This is a very rich paper, Alina.
Hello, Sarosh. Good to see you.
Really, hello. I was thinking about the transference situation with him. I was quite struck that you call him by his real name.
No, it's not his real name.
It's not his real name. I see. I thought you said David was his real name.
No.
No, okay.
Never.
Sorry. But I was wondering about the transference situation. Why, where you said that he had certain defenses against getting in touch with the void, with the emptiness. Wouldn't that come into the transference? I mean, in the sense that wouldn't he see you also as a sort of the analysis as a shell, which could keep his defenses intact in that sense?
I think it's a very good question because, for instance, if I were to, if I would have, if I had been able, given the circumstances, to film one session, I think it would be a very interesting answer to your question, because he would come in, start talking from the very first second of the session until the last, playing with his mobile phone. It was a whole battle not to have him use the mobile phone during the sessions, and he couldn't stand any gap, any moment of silence, any moment where he would have had to reflect on anything. So I think coming was a way, was a defense. Being in analysis was a defense for him. It kept him together. He could also be suicidal. So in a way, relating to your remark, Mickey, isn't the fact that he's alive something important? I think it is. He could have committed suicide in the heavy state of mind that he was in. But to a certain extent, many of the hours were used defensively. And I had to make a whole battle to, how would I say, to succeed in penetrating some of these very heavy, I would say, flooding defenses, in which my own thinking was very difficult to be kept alive, because you are flooded with thousands of small details and information that is irrelevant, most of it.
Yeah, that's always difficult because you're in the session. Very difficult to be able to be clear about what's going on. But you did mention that his shell of defenses were he bought people. He had people to follow him.
Right.
His friends and so on. He paid money to get them with him.
Money was a problem, yes.
And including the sexual encounters.
Yes.
They were all dates that he set up and so on. Including all his treatments also, the experimental treatments and tests. So was the transference situation a picture of the analysis as a sort of experimental hypothesis, which wouldn't really go anywhere? Which I don't quite know, because the people with him also must have been very careful not to disturb him, because they were paid. They were actually either in his employ or something. And you said that you were very careful. So in some unconscious way, I don't know whether there was a sort of, there could have been a sort of more narcissistic type of transference situation where one was careful not to disturb or unbalance something that was going on. Sometimes does happen without us knowing it.
That's a very interesting point, I think you make, and I have to think about it. I wouldn't like to close with an answer. I can say that there were many, what I can say at this moment without having really thinking deeply of what you are saying, is that there were many moments when after experiencing that something meaningful happened or me succeeding to touch him, there was an upheaval or a flood of irrelevant material that was whose main purpose was to fill in every second. So I could see how he reacted to moments of intimacy or of touching his mind. He couldn't bear that. That's why I made this, you know, when you write something, you take together so many sessions and you try to extract what is how would I say, more pertinent. And so there were so many moments when you could see how he actually shrinks away from any contact with his mind. So that's why I had this feeling that by touching him, when touching him, one has to be very careful. Otherwise he runs away. And in the end, through this kitten that he sort of adopted or cared for, and my relating to it, I think I was seduced into being closer to him than he was able to. And in a way, I celebrated this possibility of touching him more, because he seemed to be more opening and more emotional. And there is a possibility that this celebration of mine within myself, I mean, this use of the emotional parts that started to uncover, maybe it was premature or in a dose that he could not digest.
Or maybe in some ways there could be so many reasons that, but it's interesting to think about it. Maybe he deceived you. Maybe he got you excited,
Maybe.
and then just left you.
I
mean,
think that's why I'm saying there was a seducing part in it, yes, of seducing and abandoning.
Yes.
Yes.
And that was his, you said that was his early experience also. Objects who are either intrusive or who just went away,
Yes.
who left.
Yes.
So sort of exciting, intrusive, and then they
Yes.
just leave.
Right. Yes, that's right. So that's why I think this abandonment that I was experiencing also has, in a way, a seductive power. Even my writing is a sort of, you know, being in a way excited or provoked or made to do something that is very powerful. But anyway, he was not there anymore. So the abandonment was the main.
Yeah. The way
fact.
Mickey described it, on the way to the airport, he phoned you. It's almost as if there's this man who says, don't call me, I'll call you.
Yes,
Something
right.
like that. You know, when a man
Right.
is having another,
Yeah.
it's a sort of short-term affair,
Yeah.
and he's going off, something like that.
Right.
Also, it seemed, Saroj, that he was also frightened, no? If indeed he was emotionally touched. And that kitten self.
Can you repeat that, Mickey? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
No, I was wondering about how frightened David might have been.
In general, or
no,
at those moments when he left, you mean?
When he left, when this kitten part got touched. I mean, that would have really made him feel that he would need this all the time, no? That dependency. I mean, I heard what you said about the narcissism, but I was also thinking about this part of it.
I think that so many times when a certain part gets excited, also what gets excited, I think, in such moments is an excitation of another mother, the creation of another mother, an omnipotent mother, or powerful mother, a mother that is different than the other mother. And I think it's very complex to think how various patients at the same time are very moved, touched, and in need of such a fantasy. And at the same time, this also begins, in my experience, a very complex path where they cannot bear anything that this mother would fail. So by getting close to him and stirring, I think, this fantasy of a better mother, I already began to be meaningful to him and in danger of failing again, becoming again a mother who is not the mother that he might have wished for. I think it's a very complex area when we sometimes think that by being the good therapist and the good object, we will succeed. But it's a question what representation we actually encounter in the patient and how his representation and our being communicate with each other and what complex interactions they create. Can they be together? Is one actually thrown out? Is this new experience actually unbearable on this or another level?
Well, probably what you're saying could be quite relevant in the sense that instead of being passive and being abandoned, he turned, like you said, role reversal, and he became active, and he kind of
Was the brave.
abandoned you.
Mhm.
So he just actually reversed the roles. So in even in this manipulative collusion that he was having with the other people, with his money and power, that was a different kind of manipulative collusion where at times he was manipulating and he was also getting manipulated. And with you, it was a different kind of collusion where he actually turned the table. And just like, children also in their play takes the active role of doctors and teachers, and they turn the roles. So here probably he might have, at least therapy has done that much to him, where he has moved one stage further, where at least he is not always helpless and passive. He has at least taken that step where he is doing the same thing to the other person which he had been done to. So like Mickey was saying, so some grains of, a, a major a step, this was a major step in development. So it was a grain of success. Well, we have crossed our time, but if there is anybody who in the last moment, the last one, wants to say something or wants to ask something, we can close with that. Well, Preeti, do you want to say something?
Yes. Uh, I was thinking about the conversation around why is it that we don't talk about patients um, who we've failed with in a way, or who haven't completed their therapy. And I was thinking about how scary it is, and how the patient, how David was scared and he stopped coming to you, and perhaps our pain of looking at somebody who's stopped analysis or stopped therapy with us. um, I don't know. I'm just thinking about, that attempt that you're talking about, and what you said earlier also, about how that attempt, I'm not sure what it did to David, but perhaps it it helps you not to run away from what really happened there, And when you don't run away from that, then maybe with someone else, maybe that's a conversation that you can have, which you couldn't have had with him earlier, And so I think it's a very brave thing to do. I think to, I don't know, to put ourselves out, to put yourself out there in the way that it is, to all of this speculation, and to have this pain sort of regurgitated and, talked about in different ways from different perspectives. But that's the only way, I guess, it can be carried forward, rather than being stuck with, I don't know, that's what came to my mind. And I thought it was quite wonderful, the talk. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Preeti. Thanks, Alina. Thank you so very much to accept our request, be here today, and we could do this webinar quite well. It was such a powerful and moving presentation, and it was so thought-provoking. So thought-provoking, and probably, many of us who are present in the webinar today, probably they are still, taking time to digest it, like you said. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you,
Very
Mickey.
much for inviting me and
Welcome.
for enabling some colleagues to participate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mickey, and thank you our guests, guests from India, different cities and different countries, guests from Israel. So thank you thanks to you, because it wouldn't have been possible without you. So thanks to all of you. And we are having a webinar every month for our centenary celebration. If any of you want to join us, you can write us to IPS Kolkata 1922@gmail.com. We would invite you. With that, I close it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay well and healthy, all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.